Darkest of bleatings, seasons bleatings almost, everybody. So today I wanted to talk about some of my favourite book to film adaptations, book to movie, well actually book to screen because there's some TV in here as well. So adaptations are kind of a weird one. I think basically everything Stephen King has done almost has been adapted into a film or a TV show. We've got a lot of games being adapted now into TV shows, some films, but basically I think films get adapted a lot from another source material because there's already an inbuilt audience. So for a production company, this is sort of a guaranteed amount of money that they would like estimate they'll get, especially from Stephen King fans. So there are some good ones, there are some bad ones, but we're going to talk about ones I like today. What makes a good adaptation? I guess that's subjective. Some people really enjoy really faithful adaptations where basically the book has been used as a blueprint and there's no deviation from it, and in that case I would say that's very successful retelling in a different medium. For me personally, I do like those. So an example of that, probably the most obvious one that comes to mind for me, is Twilight. And even though for some reason some people do say, oh well, the books are better, I've read the books, the films are basically exactly the same as the books, like word for word with the dialogue and everything. So apart from the final scene in the last film, which they did change and it was wise to do so. If you've read the book, you'll know about the battle. Anyway, for me, a really good adaptation is when the source material, the book, has been adapted for the screen, and maybe they've had to make changes because some things that work in a book won't work on screen, stuff like that, but they found ways around the problem that really work for the film. And also, I always think that a really good adaptation can kind of dig into the themes of the book and maybe elevate the story a little bit. So it's really rare that I will ever say, oh, I liked the film more than the book, but it has happened. But quite often with particular directors, and there are two that are going to come up twice on this list of only 5 I'm talking about, yeah, some directors you can tell are really big fans of the source material and they really want to do it justice. So let's get into it. Speaking of Stephen King, so the first thing on the list is The Mist, which is a novella that was originally published in Skeleton Crew, but you can find it on its own now. And for anyone who doesn't know, The Mist is about a group of people who are trapped in a local small supermarket when this very mysterious weird mist rolls in after a huge storm one night, and there are things in the mist, so it's dangerous to go into the mist. It's really thick, so they can't actually see what's in it unless they're actually in the mist. And to top everything off, they're getting that sort of cabin fever kind of thing when they're all stuck together in this supermarket. Everyone's terrified, obviously, power outages, like the normal kind of survival stuff. And there's also a character called Mrs. Carmody that's in the town known to be kind of like a religious nut, and no one takes her seriously until they do, because they don't have answers, they're all very scared, and she's sort of giving answers for what's going on and instruction on what to do next. So some of the people, they start following her, and then it suddenly becomes very dangerous inside the supermarket as well. So it's a really good story. It's my favourite Stephen King story of all time. I love it. I've always loved it, and I think that the film adaptation that was it was adapted and directed by Frank Darabont, who is one of the best people at adapting. He also adapted and directed The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, which are 2 of by far the most successful Stephen King adaptations. So he's obviously a King fan, and he knows what he's doing when it comes to taking a story off the page and putting it onto the screen. The reason that I think this adaptation is so good is that it is very faithful to the book. The characters are the same. He's kind of like conflated a couple just for ease and shortening things down a little bit, so it fits nicely into a film runtime, but it's mostly really faithful. The characters are very like the characters in the book, and they had a very limited budget because he had an idea about what he wanted to do with the ending, which we'll get to in a minute, and the production company was not happy. They wanted a much happier ending, and they told him that they would give him millions more for the budget if he did it, and he refused for the sake of integrity, and so didn't have a lot of money in film speak to work with. So Greg Nicotero did the special effects. Huge Nicotero fan, he's amazing. And they did the best they could. There's a black and white version which is as it was intended to be seen, but again, production interference, they didn't think people would go see a black and white film. But if you watch it in black and white, it is the better version in my opinion, because it adds to the atmosphere, and also the monsters, for the things that they did have to use CGI for, do look better. So the thing that pushed it over the top for me in terms of adaptations, and why I think this is honestly one of the best film adaptations I've ever seen, is because Stephen King has a pseudonym, or he used to write under Richard Bachman as well, and the Richard Bachman books are known for being like the nastier Stephen King ideas, maybe the not very happy endings. Like, Stephen King is quite a positive person, and most of his horror stories do end on a somewhat triumphant or positive or hopeful note, whereas the Bachman books tend to be quite bleak in tone and with their endings, and even the characters. He's dealing with very unpleasant characters a lot of the time in the Bachman books. And what I feel like Frank Darabont did when he adapted it was he took a Stephen King story and he Richard Bachman'd it. So there are some little bits in the book where, for example, they're afraid that some of the monsters are going to get into the supermarket, and Darabont took that fear and he like pulled it a little bit further, drew it out. He went a bit further in the film than it went in the book, and it was nastier. And then there's another scene where somebody really needs some medical supplies, so they're talking about going to the pharmacy next door, and Frank Darabont like pulled that as well, like really drew that out into something much worse than it was in the book, and it's nastier. And then with the ending, which I won't spoil for anybody, but the end of the film is very different to the end of the book, and it's brutal. And it's the one where everyone always talks, like when you're talking about brutal film endings, this is the one that comes up time after time. I feel like this is the Richard Bachman ending. So I think what Darabont did was, as well as making an excellent horror film, a really faithful adaptation, I think he really dug into King's writing and pulled out more. So it's really true to Stephen King / Richard Bachman, but also it's got Darabont flair to it. So I just thought that was it's one of my favourites of all time. Next, True Blood, the show which is based on the Charlene Harris Sookie Stackhouse, or I think they're the Southern Gothic vampire novels or something. They had a couple of different names. So I did read these. There are more than these books, but I've stopped at this. I was bought this box set as a gift, so I read them all. So for anyone who doesn't know, it's about Sookie Stackhouse, who is a telepath, and everyone locally knows that she's telepathic, and she's kind of an outcast because of it. She never had a relationship because, firstly, people are freaked out that she can read their minds. Secondly, she doesn't always want to hear what they're thinking, and it just happens to her. So she always hears like the gross things that people are thinking, and so she doesn't really trust people very much because of that. And then vampires come out of the coffin and announce their existence to the world, and they want to live amongst humans, and then there's a very strong reaction about that. So some people are really excited. Vampires, the spokespeople vampires, are sort of assuring everybody that they're harmless, they just want to live amongst everybody else. And then there are others who know that they're actually dangerous, and they've tarred them all with one brush, and they're really afraid of them. So there's like some politics, there's some social politics going on. And then there's obviously Sookie with her, you know, she's now having a boyfriend, and she's got very few friends because of all of this stuff. The reason that I think that the show is such a good adaptation is because it took the potential of the books. The show took the potential that was in the books and used it, whereas unfortunately, it just, in my opinion, I know a lot of people really love these books, but the books introduce like these great ideas. Like the coming out of the coffin thing is such an obvious, brilliant analogy for people having to come out of the closet. And then I just felt like the books didn't do anything with it. It was just like a funny phrase. And that was as far as that went. Also, character-wise, the books are really not very diverse. There's like diversity in the supernatural creatures. Sure, there's, you know, vampires and werewolves and you're kind of your staples, but there's, I mean, basically all of the characters are white, and the ones who aren't get killed pretty fast. There's a bit of stereotyping, I think, in my opinion. And then there's no real sexual diversity at all. And I'm not saying that everything has to have that, but if you're writing a world with loads of different characters and all of them, like, generally speaking, are like white and straight, I don't know, it's a bit, I don't know. So what the show did that was different was the inclusion of more ethnicities, and more viewpoints and experiences. It was way more interesting, especially because I think the show went for 7 seasons. So like, we got Suki, a main character, and then she's surrounded by the cast of other characters, and everyone's got really interesting backstories, including the vampire characters and everybody else. And then also the it's a funny show, and also like the sexual orientation, like the diversity in that, it makes for really good comedy, especially with the vampire characters who all seem to be aggressively bisexual, as Erica Summers would say. It's so, it was just so refreshing, and especially because I forget what year the first season came out, but I'll put it on the screen. It's still not seen now, especially now because of the rise of bloody prejudiced people. Just like, all of a sudden everyone seems to have found their voice and they're very loud with it. I actually feel like we're going backwards, which is sad, but this show was ahead of its time, and it would be ahead of its time if it came out today, to be honest. And I don't think it got enough credit for that. I can't think of a single other show that was as open-minded just across the board with everything. So yeah, I think that the reason that's such a strong adaptation is because it took sort of like the seeds of what the books had, and it really grew flowers out of it. Number 3 is one of the Dracula adaptations by Bram Stoker, of course. I love this edition, by the way, I just wanted to show it off. It's the Francis Ford Coppola Bram Stoker's Dracula, although I don't think it was very well named. Like, it shouldn't really been called Bram Stoker's Dracula, because it really isn't. It's Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, but of all of the literal hundreds of adaptations of that, I really think it's the best one, because it uses the basic structure and story and characters of the book, but it just made everyone so much more. Again, kind of like True Blood, I guess. So if you haven't read the Book of Dracula, you're probably familiar with the basic story because it's so sort of culturally embedded in us. But Count Dracula is from Transylvania. He buys property in London. His London solicitor goes over to his castle, is imprisoned. There's all stuff with vampire brides. He has a bad time there, and he wants to get home to his love Mina, and then Dracula goes home ahead to London, attacks Mina, and everybody around her is trying to save her before it's too late, and trying to vanquish Dracula. And that's like the basic story, and for the most part the adaptations have run with that. The problem that I think Dracula the book has, and this is probably a controversial opinion, and I want to assure everyone that I really love this book. I've read it several times. I do think it's a gothic masterpiece, but Dracula is really one-dimensional and really isn't in the book very much. It's more the characters sort of dealing with the threat, which I'm fine with as a book goes, but when you're making something into a film, a one-dimensional villain isn't very compelling, in my opinion. I've never, again, people are going to be mad at me for this, I've never really liked the old Dracula films, like the Hammer horror ones and stuff, because as much as I like the actors who portray him and the look, the aesthetic and all of that, Dracula's boring. And they do, every film adaptation just about has drawn out the character a bit more, giving him a little bit more screen time, giving him a little bit more personality, but Dracula is just a vampire, and his only motivation is eating people, in particular Mina. The Francis Ford Coppola Dracula is just a work of art. It's spectacular. Everything about it, from the soundtrack, the costume design, the sets, everything, it's just so gorgeous and rich and layered, and there's so much thought has gone into absolutely every element of it, and all of those things combined just give it this, like, god, the atmosphere of that thing. And yes, there might be some questionable accents, performances in there maybe, but for the most part it's an absolutely stellar cast, and Gary Oldman as Dracula was so good. And this is something that people complain about with this adaptation, that they veered off Dracula's character, and there was no love story in the book with Dracula and Mina, really. And in this version of, in Coppola's version of it, Mina is the reincarnated love of Dracula's life. The reason that he's a vampire is because he sort of like cursed in the name of God when she was taken from him, and he's, you know, travelled across time to find it. And so basically it's a gothic romance horror, but you don't really know who to root for, because Dracula is such a sympathetic character that you forget a lot of the time that he's also a despicable, horrible monster when it comes to anyone apart from Mina. So like, I found myself really rooting for him the first 1,000 times I watched it when I was younger. I just really wanted him to get the girl, and then the older I got, the more I thought, oh no, I don't think that's right. I think I think this is messed up. But it's just, I don't know, it just gave so much more to the character than he's ever had before. And I think there's a reason why people kind of, I mean, I know there are still Dracula things coming out, but basically for the most part, all the wave of Dracula adaptations that have been going on for decades kind of just stopped there. And for good reason. I don't think anyone's ever going to outdo the Coppola version. It's another Stephen King next. It was kind of inevitable, but I'm going to go with Dr. Sleep for my next one. Now, Mike Flanagan, I think, is kind of the king of adapting books. So Mike Flanagan did The Haunting of Hill House, Bly Manor, Midnight Mass, which was an original script, not an adaptation, and The Fall of the House of Usher, and he did Dr. Sleep. And I think that he is really, really good at getting into like the nuts and bolts of a story and like really drawing it out into something more for the screen, especially television. But for Dr. Sleep, I was really impressed because he had a really unique challenge for Dr. Sleep. And please let me know in the comments if there are other examples of this, because I can't think of any. But his challenge with making Dr. Sleep is that Dr. Sleep is a sequel to The Shining, the book. So he was making an adaptation of this book which follows on from the stuff that happened in The Shining, but he was also making a sequel to the film The Shining, which Stanley Kubrick made, and Stanley Kubrick changed quite a lot of stuff that's actually instrumental here. So The Shining's been out for so long now, so I'm gonna have to give a couple of the Shining spoilers, but nothing for here. So for example, the Shining ends completely differently in the book. Jack still dies, but in the Kubrick film he dies by freezing to death in the hedge maze after losing his mind and chasing Danny around in the snow. In the film he dies because he hasn't been maintaining the boiler because he's been losing it, and then he blows up with the hotel. So the hotel's gone, the Overlook is rubble, it's not there anymore, whereas in the Kubrick film it's still very much standing and same as ever. Also, Halloran gets killed immediately when he turns up to help Wendy and Danny in the film, whereas in the book he doesn't, he helps them, so he's still alive. So those are two quite crucial differences, because both of those things are relevant to the story in Dr. Sleep, the location and Halloran. So I was wondering how on earth anyone in the world was going to be able to adapt a book but also make a sequel to a film that was true to the book and also satisfying for people who just watched the Kubrick film, and how he was going to do this, because that's a lot of problems to try and overcome, and he did it. I was so impressed. I really couldn't believe it, honestly. I kept expecting there to be some horrible plot holy thing or some like major convenience thing which didn't fit or whatever. But no, he nailed it. And the last one I'm going to talk about, which was a TV show, and bear with me for a sec when I bring it up, because it's The Walking Dead, again adapted by Frank Darabont, and it's based on the graphic novels by Robert Kirkman and Charlie Adlard and Tony Moore and Cliff Rathbone. So Robert Kirkman did the story, I think everyone else did the art. So I did watch The Walking Dead, the show, to the bitter end. I was pretty mad with how it ended because I really felt like that finale episode was just a trailer for all of the side spin-off shows without actually wrapping up much in the way of the main show at all. But that's a rant for another day. But the thing I think that was done really well, so adapting something from a graphic novel, you do have visuals on account of the art and the panels and stuff that you can go off. It's kind of like a storyboard already created for you. But the thing with adapting something, so I know that Frank Darabont spent like 6 years adapting this for seasons 1 and 2, and he got rejected by everybody. Nobody thought a zombie show based on a comic book was going to work, and then it showed them, and then he unceremoniously got fired before season 3. And I have to say, who fires the guy responsible for the Shawshank Redemption and the Green Mile before the prison season? But that's again a whole rant for another day. Anyway, so Frank Darabont had to appease the comic book fans and also make something that was going to be compelling for a new audience. And the way that he did it was by constantly subverting details in the comic books, but in ways that were going to be really satisfying for comic book fans rather than irritating because of he's deviated. So it was the way that he was creating tension. So for a brand new audience, all of this stuff is a surprise anyway. That the new audience isn't really the issue, or isn't like the main thing he has to consider when he's like plotting the story and everything in these scenes. But the comic book audience, like, I like a faithful adaptation, but I don't really want to see just a screen version of something I've already read, and see it played out, you know, exactly the same. I would like there to be something a bit more. So what Darabont did was, in scenes of particular tension, he'd flip it. So he'd set things up the way they're set up in the comic. For example, when Rick's walking around the hospital, he has to go into a stairwell, all the lights are off, it's pitch black, and he's just got a lighter. You might remember this from the show if you've seen it. So he's going down the stairs flicking the lighter, and you keep expecting him to flick it on and there's something in the stairwell suddenly, but he just makes it out. In the comic, he's going down the stairs flicking the lighter, and then at some point he does flick it on and the stairwell's full of zombies. So we had like this building for the like a TV audience is already gonna be scared there's something in there because that's such a typical sort of horror setup. But all the comic book fans, we were all just like, oh my god, it's the zombie stairwell, and then he doesn't do it. So it's like you get this kind of like little funny relief of like, oh, and then because he kept doing things like that so often, you, even when you know the story really well from the comics, you can't predict what he's gonna do. There were new characters added in, so Daryl Dixon doesn't exist in the comics. That's the most notable main character, but there are several characters that were sort of merged together, or new ones that were added. A lot of the time he would take a storyline that was happening to one character and he'd give it to a different character in the show, which was always really fun because I'd be waiting for the thing to happen to the one character, and then I'd be like, wait a minute, I think he's planting the seeds for somebody else. So it was just like this constant like revolving door. And then just when you expect him to zag and you're looking for the character that he might be doing the thing to instead of the comic one, he does it to the comic book one. So it's like, yeah, he zigs when you think he's gonna zag, and then when you expect him to zag, he does, and then he zigs. Like, it was just really fun. It was just really, it was just so well done. And even though I think a lot of people would probably agree with me that the quality of the writing, and I really don't mean this disrespectfully to the writers, people have got a lot more time to write seasons 1 and 2 of a thing than they do for every following season. People work for years on season 1 scripts, and then they only have like 6 months to do season 2. There are a lot of factors that go into it, but I do think that the writing did suffer gradually a bit more and more towards the end of the show. But those first 2 seasons, the 3rd season even, I do think that was some of the most solid TV that's ever been. I'd love to know what you think, especially about Dracula if you've read the book. I'd love to know if you disagree with me. I love to get into a good little debate. Everyone's opinions are valid, obviously, but that's why it's really fun to talk about these things. If you have any suggestions for what I could talk about next, I'd love to make this a little running series because there are so many adapted things. Let me know what your favourite and least favourite adaptations are. I'm probably not going to do a video on, you know, the ones I hate because I try to be positive, but I do have some that I hate. I'm just not going to talk about them here. Have you subscribed? If you don't subscribe, I'm going to shave all of Kaylee's hair off. I hope this video was fun. I post videos every Thursday, Saturday and Sunday. Please